Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th Hour, helping you remember everything that happened beyond the 24/7 news cycle. Joining us this week for an exciting conversation is New York Law School professor Rebecca Roiphe. Professor Roiphe had experience working as a prosecutor for the Manhattan District Attorney prior to joining academia, and had also clerked for Judge Bruce Selya, who sits on the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Apart from working as a professor, Rebecca Roiphe has written numerous articles ranging from examining the American historical examples of prosecutorial independence and presidential power to the fundamental ethical obligations lawyers carry with them in their daily practice. Her articles can be read in various publications, including Slate, Politico, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. And Professor Roiphe has made appearances on CNN and MSNBC as a legal analyst, having discussed former special counsel Robert Mueller's probe into Russian influence in the 2016 election, as well as our topic today, the impeachment of former President Donald Trump. Okay, Professor Roiphe, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's just jump right into it. I think that for people who are in tune with our political discourse in these days, they weren't particularly surprised about President Trump being acquitted in the Senate. The reason for that being that, I think most people are aware of the constitutional 2/3 majority in the Senate to convict a former president, or I think it's any executive official for that matter. But at the end of the day, I think that there's a message that could be sent to the rest of the country in terms of Trump's acquittal, isn't there? I mean, what would you say that means for the country in general, in your opinion?
It's a great question. I think that impeachment is really more of a political process than it is a legal process. And it's particularly because of what you just mentioned, the 2/3 majority. It really ends up being an expression of political will more than a legal proceeding. And so it kind of masquerades as a court proceeding, leading people, I think, to believe that it's more regulated by the norms of the law and procedures in courtrooms than it actually is. And so, to a certain extent, I think this impeachment, like all impeachments, is going to be unto itself. I don't know that it sets so much of a precedent for the future because of the political nature of things. And so there's that. But I think there's a broader question in your comments, which is about the presidency itself. What does this say about the presidency itself? And I think the Trump presidency and his lack of accountability for the many things that people think he should have been held accountable for really lays bare, to me, how few protections there are against a president who chooses to ignore norms and to a certain extent even ignore the law. So, I think about this time, it just struck me this one time that Kellyanne Conway said on TV, she was being accused of violating the Hatch Act, which essentially says that certain government employees aren't allowed to use their office for political campaigning. And she had been doing it and she was accused of doing it. And she said, when does the jail term start? Really saying, I don't care about the law unless there's a mechanism of enforcement. And that's like the Trump presidency in a nutshell. Unless you can make me do it, I'll do whatever I want and whatever I can get away with. And so, I think that's something that, perhaps people always knew, but never really confronted. And so the question is, going forward, do we return to a world in which presidents respect these lines, not because, they're going to face consequences from them, but because that's the way our country works and that's the way tradition has it. And that's the way people have always done things, out of a general respect for the law, for our institutions, for democracy itself? Or do they continue in this vein where they're like, wow, I can get away with so much because the mechanisms of enforcement aren't really there. And so the checks and balances on the executive aren't really there. So in a certain way, I guess this remains to be seen. I can't predict, but I think there's a troubling fact in there that's revealed. If not, it's not new. It's just that we can now all see it and future presidents can see it. And, I wouldn't be surprised if some try to exploit it.
Right. I've heard before in other circles and other articles that, all it takes is for someone with a Trumpian goal or mindset, but with a little bit more competence than the former president, if they took it to another level, knowing the acquittal of former President Trump, what would somebody in the future be able to pull off? And can you characterize your confidence in the future when it comes to presidential impeachments and the high crimes and misdemeanors standard that's put in place? It sounds like it's a little shaky to me.
Yeah, it's shaky. I mean, I think it really is a reflection of political will. So the fact is, a president will be held responsible to the extent that that is politically advantageous to those in power, and that's a disturbing thing. I mean, not to say there are other ways. This isn't our only mechanism, but it's our central one, and it's flawed. I think it's largely flawed because when the founders conceived of this, they didn't really think of party being so powerful. They thought of the branches of government having loyalty to themselves, sort of institutional loyalty to the Congress itself, and we saw that disappear. I mean, not that in recent years, in recent decades, it hasn't been like that, but oh my God, a Congress that isn't even willing to protect itself when it was directly under attack, whether you thought incited by the president or not, at least by the president's supporters and ultimately not denounced by the president. So, that's astonishing. It's astonishing that their loyalty is to party and president and individual far more than it is to Congress. And that just makes impeachment seem, very unlikely to happen. It's a very weak check at this point on the president. I mean, and that's not even to mention the ways in which he also evaded responsibility by not responding to subpoenas, the blanket refusal during all of this investigation to provide any information, not in the Mueller probe, but in these congressional probes and during the impeachment is also, I mean, that's not the way it's done. That's not the way it has been done. There's always been a negotiation, but there's no enforcement mechanism. So, I do worry about that. And I do think, we are very much dependent on the character of the people we elect, to hold office.
Professor, one of the biggest defenses that Republicans have been clinging to, and whether someone supports that or not, it's the claim that the Senate doesn't have jurisdiction to try a former president, and that's because of the way that they're interpreting the language of the Constitution. And, there are definitely strong voices countering that actually the language of the Constitution does allow for that jurisdiction to be in place, and have even used the precedent of a former war secretary, I believe he was a war secretary, William Belknap, who, although he was acquitted by, I think it was one vote, and you're a great student of history, so you could tell us about that. Where do you stand on that claim? I think one of the biggest things that Republicans said is, if you want to start trying former presidents, let's bring in Obama, for example, right? So I wanted to know what your take on that claim, on that defense was.
So first of all, I think it's important to remember that President Trump was impeached while he was president. And he was only tried after he left office. So that, I think, is an important fact, though not necessarily determinative. My view here is that there is evidence on both sides, but the bulk of the evidence really does point toward Congress's ability to impeach and try a former official, including a former president, for high crimes and misdemeanors that he committed while in office. So the reason why I say that is, because I think that the text of the Constitution points to that. It includes the disqualification remedy, and that remedy would be essentially a nullity if it weren't possible to try a former president. And that's because any official could simply avoid trial by resignation. So let's say I wanted to avoid the disqualification remedy and I was about to be tried by Congress, or I was about to be impeached. I could just offer my resignation. In fact, that is what happened with William Belknap. He tried to get out of it. He didn't want that stain on his reputation and that harm to his future political career. So he tried to step down, and everybody said, sorry, that's not going to work. We can still do this. And so, I think that's really telling, because you look at the language and the purpose, and they seem to support the ability to do this. Finally, as you mentioned, history is on that side as well, not only in the case that you mentioned, but many other cases, and particularly British history. And so the American Constitution didn't grow out of nowhere. It isn't a carbon copy of England, but there are many things that the framers imported from the English precedent. And this is one of them. For impeachment, they really looked to England for a model. And so I think, given the fact that the history of impeachment in England and in America, combined with the text and the purpose of impeachment, really point to the fact that you can do this. So, again, it's a political process. And I think that the Republicans, many of them wanted to be able to hide behind something procedural like this because the facts in this case are pretty damning. But I personally think it's a pretty weak case.
And it's one of the things I'm struggling with is that when I have conversations with family and friends that are more on Trump's side, they're not vociferous news consumers. They're stuck in the echo chamber that most of our country has now been pushed to, both on the left and the right. A member of my family asked me the other day, how can Democrats convict Trump on this charge of inciting an insurrection, and when we have such strong First Amendment protections and basically alluding to the Brandenburg test of inciting an insurrection. And as I started to begin to explain that it wasn't a legal proceeding per se, right? I mean, even the jurors are witnesses in this case, and even met with Trump's defense team. As soon as I said it was actually a political mechanism that's crafted by the founders in the very beginning, that person I was talking to scoffed and said, "Of course it is. Of course it is," as if this was a preordained game that Democrats were playing and that this was basically without merit. Yeah. So how would you send the message to those who I think are at their 100% cynical at this point about the guardrails in our democratic system?
Well, I think that political has gotten such a bad name. I mean, it's not necessarily bad that it's a political mechanism. It's okay that it's that way. It's meant to be really hard to hold, to impeach a president. And that's good because we don't really want, one political party to just disagree with the president and be like, impeached. That's what, of course, the Republicans were strategically trying to claim was happening. But that there is a fear of that. And so the 2/3 majority is good that way. And we do always have elections, presuming that we can keep them to hold our elected officials responsible. But, you ask a really good question, which is, also about these echo chambers, because something like the impeachment, when everybody's watching, it really upset me that these lawyers, the First Amendment question, for instance, it's like, people are paying attention. It's a moment to educate, and I get that you have a client and that you're trying to represent that client, but distorting the law beyond recognition is really bad. It's bad for the public. I mean, I'm not suggesting there's anything to necessarily do about that, but really, there's a moment to understand things, understand the First Amendment, what it actually protects against and what it doesn't protect against, and what high crimes and misdemeanors mean. And, instead we just have this thing that looks like, a reality television show. And that's really, really bad, and in part just, sends people back to their corners where they're in their echo chambers, as you say. And, I don't know what to do about that particularly, although, I do think one thing is I think our education system has really failed, that people, come to this with so little knowledge already that they are incapable of assessing on their own the merits of these arguments.
Right. I think that's, I think my little contribution regarding the 25th hour, I wanted there to be a place for people to be able to go back and see what happened in a weekly format, because I think people are forgetting. They're just simply forgetting. And it's, it could be the reality of our high, fast-paced life and the 24/7 news cycle, but people are, I think, not realizing where they're living in terms of the form of government that they're participating in. and it's a big obstacle that I think is going to not be solved in the next, I don't know if it'll happen within Biden's presidency at all. And I don't know if it'll happen within the next 5 presidencies. It's something that our society is going to definitely grapple with. But I could talk to you all day about that topic, and I'd like to move on to what Trump has to worry about. So is Trump off the hook now? I mean, what is he awaiting in his post-presidency life at Mar-a-Lago?
So former President Trump faces a lot of lawsuits, criminal investigations. He has lost the protection that he had when he was president. There's a opinion within the executive branch that's largely respected, where the argument is that a sitting president cannot be indicted for certain crimes. Also, that there's a limit to the civil investigations even that can go into a president, because we don't want a president to be impaired in his ability to carry out his job. So this gives him a cloak of protection, a shield against all of these lawsuits and investigations, and not a complete shield, as we've seen, but a significant one, especially if he's willing, as we were just talking about, to exploit it as much as he possibly can. So he no longer has those things. And I think he's sitting there, he's facing an uncertain political future and a long consuming legal battle on multiple different fronts.
And are these lawsuits trivial? I mean, is it something that, Trump doesn't have to worry about, that he can just scoff at, or are they actual serious suits that can, really impact Trump?
So I certainly think they're not trivial. I mean, to generalize is always a danger. So some of them may be trivial, but I definitely think that there are many serious allegations and investigations. Now, what they ultimately end up uncovering, we don't know, and maybe he'll be able to withstand them, but they are not something he can just bat away. He's going to have to spend a great deal of money and time fighting these lawsuits. And, one of the interesting things that I'm watching is, to what extent is what worked for him when he was president going to work for him now? So part of what worked for him, obviously, was the legal cloak that I just spoke of, the Department of Justice opinion that says you can't indict a sitting president. But another thing that worked for him was rhetoric. So he would say, anytime there was an allegation of anything, civil wrongdoing, criminal wrongdoing, anything, he would say, this is a Democrat witch hunt. This is, just my political opposition after me. And, to a certain extent, that worked not only legally, but particularly in terms of scaring people off. It made them people concerned who were trying to hold him accountable, that they would be labeled, branded, partisan warrior. And, none of us people want that. So I'm curious, I'm just interested in two things, which is, one, the legal merits of these cases, and two, the ability what remains of his ability to fight this on the public relations front by undermining everything in a way that, by suggesting that they're illegitimate because they're politically motivated.
And I think, by way of recollection for our listeners, Trump has tried, I think, not everything in the book. Somebody could certainly think of his comment about just shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue, right, and him getting away with something, him sicking supporters on judges and whatnot. But he has pointed out a judge's ethnicity, for example, as a way to try to paint some sort of bias in a case against him. And, I think that listeners may have already forgotten the extent to which Trump has went to try and get rid of the lawsuits that were filed against him. I mean, is there anything else that you remember that was particularly jarring about his defenses?
So, I mean, there was the time when he said, there are Obama judges and there are Trump judges, and Justice Roberts jump up and say, wait, no, hold on a second, there are just judges. So, he really was saying it's like, they're my people and then they're the other people. And if they have power, they're going to try to use that power to undermine me. So, there was that. He has certainly used things in the past. And, I should mention, I don't think he has a monopoly on doing this. I think that there's, this is something that affects everybody. And for instance, the Attorney General of New York, Letitia James, she campaigned on the statement that she was going to go after Trump. And so that makes, that plays right into his hand. So I don't, I think it's a particularly worrisome disease, this idea that all there is political vendettas and power, and that law means nothing other than that. Those of us like you who have devoted the time to go to law school and think about the law know and understand that it's something different, that it really is, meaningful processes and rules meant to hold everybody equally accountable. But it's taken a significant blow during this period of time. And I don't know. I think he loses a significant amount of power to do that now that he's no longer president, but maybe not entirely.
Right. And we'll keep our eye on how strong our court system is now that Trump is not the president anymore and commands, a legion of primary voters. And we have yet to see also how strong he'll be in 2024, especially now that he has vowed to primary anyone who's on Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell's side. But what I want to go into now is ask you about, to delve into kind of what are the substantive problems that Trump is facing. I think a broad overview that listeners may remember is that, Trump has to defend charges of fraud when it comes to his company. He can't operate a nonprofit in New York anymore, if I recall correctly. He has lawsuits regarding sexual assault or defamation, rather, especially from E. Jean Carroll. So is that hitting the nail on the head correctly when it comes to what Trump has to worry about substantively?
Yeah. So basically, I would say, there's so many. So we can't really catalog all of the lawsuits that he's facing, but I would lump them into categories, and you basically hit on all of them. And first of all, you can separate out, there's criminal liability, potential criminal liability that he faces, and then there's civil liability that he faces. So the criminal investigations that we know about are, as you said, the New York County District Attorney's Office is looking into potential tax and bank fraud. And those are from activities that pre-existed his presidency, right? So those are his business activities in New York. And that's what has been the subject of the ongoing battle for his taxes that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, was sent back down, has been litigated again, and is now awaiting another decision by the Supreme Court. So that's one important one to look into. The New York County District Attorney's Office is also looking into those hush money payments. So as you said, a week can be an eternity in this particular news cycle. But if people remember a while back, the president's former attorney and fixer, Michael Cohen, pled guilty to a number of crimes. And one of the crimes that he pled guilty to was a campaign finance crime involving these hush money payments to the former I think two separate porn stars that he had affairs with, that he apparently paid off to remain silent, and never revealed this in his campaign finance statements. So in the guilty plea, the Southern District of New York, this is federal prosecutors actually, named the president as individual one, it seems. So Michael Cohen wasn't acting on his own. He was acting at the direction of the president. So that's potential criminal liability. I think that one's pretty dead in the water. I don't think anybody is pursuing that. It doesn't look like the Southern District is interested in pursuing the president any further, but it is part of the state case now and could amount to a violation of state law as well, particularly falsification of business records, which is like a kind of fraud case that the state could bring. So there's that tax and bank fraud, there's the hush money payments, and then of course there's this criminal liability potentially in Georgia for inciting for election fraud. So particularly the number of calls that he made, including the one that we all remember hearing with Brad Raffensperger, who was the Secretary of State of Georgia, in which he said, find the votes. So Fulton County, which is where Atlanta is, has started a probe into that. And I mean that, that if you read the election fraud statute, it's not inconceivable that he could face some criminal liability in Georgia. Finally, there are those. So then next, there are the civil cases, and the civil cases also can be sort of basically grouped, and they're those that fall under the real estate fraud, and particularly the Attorney General of New York has been looking into those. And that's basically the same kind of bank and tax fraud that the Manhattan DA is looking into. Like, did he falsely inflate the value of his assets in order to get loans, or conversely, did he underestimate them in order to pay fewer taxes? Did he engage in tax, real estate, insurance fraud, prior to his election? Then, as you mentioned, there are those sexual harassment cases. I think there are two notable ones, and maybe even others. There's E. Jean Carroll, as you mentioned, and then Summer Zervos is another one. And those are women who accused the president, as you said, of sexual harassment, and then he said things in response that they are now suing for defamation. And those cases, he really has not been able to get them eliminated, though he tried, but he has delayed them significantly. His ability to delay those cases is basically gone. I mean, because he used to be able to say, well, I'm president. You can't, I need a wide timeline to respond to these things. And he just kind of pushed them off. But now he has no capability of doing that. He's just like a private citizen, and he's going to have to respond. And there's going to be a lot of information in those cases that he's going to have to produce because, I don't know what the truth of the matter is, but they're claiming that he lied, and that leads to a lot of that will lead to a lot of discovery that could be pretty damning. So those are basically it. I think there's Mary Trump, who's his relative who published the book about him, has also accused him of cheating her out of his inheritance. So that's another one. There are really quite a few, but that's basically a sort of map of the terrain of the lawsuits that he will face now that he's a private citizen.
Yeah, it sounds like Trump is definitely going to be busy. I mean, so thank you for, so masterfully organizing the lawsuits that he's facing. And, having trust in the justice system is sort of like a double-edged sword in that if we have faith in our justice system to do what's right, we have to give it the time to actually go through the process. And that can be very frustrating. And many people in this day and age won't have the patience to wait for the court system to go through all of the different processes in place in order to, for example, give defendants due process, give time for counsel to review discovery. And you were my former criminal procedure professor. You taught me very well that these things do take time, despite even sometimes the right to a speedy trial when it comes to criminal cases. So which case is the most advanced currently in its procedural stage?
So I would assume, it's again, the other thing is it's a little hard to know, and that can be frustrating. And people don't, one other thing that I think, the general public is not entirely aware of, which is, the need for secrecy, that things don't come out until they come out. Only certain parts of investigations become public. And all of that is part of the due process protections that we have for people, both in criminal cases and in civil cases, that, this doesn't get all played out. Some of it does in the public and in the media, but a lot of it doesn't. So a lot of things will remain private and secret, and therefore we don't know, and therefore it's a little hard for me to predict. But I from what I can tell, I think that the case in Manhattan has proceeded along. They're waiting again for those taxes, and I can't really understand why the Supreme Court has taken so long. I think they should have to decide that one pretty quickly. And, I would assume that the grand jury has already looked at the other evidence in that case. And, if they're going to put together a criminal charge, my guess is it wouldn't be so far away. But again, it's hard to know. And then I think also in terms of the civil cases, the defamation cases, they could hurt him. They could hurt him reputationally. There could be monetary damages. But I think that he also faces a pretty serious challenge from Letitia James and her office in terms of that investigation of fraud. Because even if Vance can't meet the high burden for a criminal case, you have to prove a criminal case beyond a reasonable doubt, it is entirely possible that the same facts could be a very compelling civil case against him, and he could face serious monetary damages and, as you suggested, some consequences for his ability to do business in New York.
And so now I want to get to what I think is sort of the $1 million question for a lot of people is, how realistic are the chances that we'll see Trump and or his associates end up in jail?
So again, it's hard to know. And I know that's a frustrating answer. I don't know. And I think, it's quite public what happened in Georgia in terms of the election. And it's quite public in terms of those hush money payments. But what isn't public is the fraud and allegations. So I don't know how much proof they have. If they have a very solid case, then I think, it's not an insignificant chance. Here's the difficulty in those kinds of cases in establishing proof beyond a reasonable doubt for a criminal case, which is you need to prove intent. So the mere fact that somebody might have, you can say, oh, look, his property is worth far less than what he said on this loan application. That's a piece of proof, but that is not sufficient for the criminal charges, because you have to show that he intended to engage in fraud. And that's quite hard to do, and especially hard to do in this context, because in the real estate world, people really are the business practice, and it's kind of an ugly business practice, but the business practice is sort of, not very clear, and people do play these kinds of games quite a bit. So how do you prove that he's stepped over the line of what's acceptable and that he intended to do it? It's really, really hard. So that is one obstacle. And in terms of the Georgia case, I know that the prosecutor has made it clear that she's very serious about bringing these charges or investigating this case. I'm a little bit skeptical, because I think that the intent prong is particularly hard in that context as well. Even though we have the tape there and he said things like, this is, find the votes and things that, most normal listeners or many normal listeners heard that and they were like, he's not really interested in uncovering fraud. He really just wants to win. But he has this defense always of like, I didn't really think that, I was just asking him to do his job. I was just asking him to go over things again because I'm sure there's fraud. And so the intent prong is really hard to prove there. So bottom line, I'm not holding my breath. I think that he could face pretty serious civil consequences. I think both his civil and criminal liability, which could potentially be extensive, depend on how much evidence there is of his state of mind in terms of the fraud claims.
That's, I do find it very interesting you said that. I think it's in Reuters also that you were quoted in saying that it's going to be really hard to prove Trump's intent to commit a crime, especially in the context of fraud in his property deals. So, if you were a part of the prosecutor's team, or if you're, the private attorney that's representing E. Jean Carroll, for example, I mean, is that one of the biggest obstacles then, like you said, or what would your strategy be? I mean, is there a possibility we can try and force depositions from the former president? Because we see how great he performs in former depositions. I would urge our listeners to Google that, because it's definitely something. He has sat for depositions before. So, I mean, what would your take on that be?
Yeah, I definitely think he's going to have to. There's not really going to be a way to avoid the depositions anymore. And so I think that will happen. So sometimes, you can prove intent with circumstantial evidence. You can even prove intent beyond reasonable doubt with circumstantial evidence. And prosecutors do it all the time. They say, they ask the jury to draw inferences, and it's really the only reasonable inference from the facts, and the jury can do it. In this case, I think that's going to be pretty hard. And I think what they're going to need is some witnesses. And so, that's why I say I really don't know. If there are people within his organization or people who had spoken to him who can say, this is what was going on, that's a smoking gun that it's hard for prosecutors to get, but I think might be critical in a case like this.
And now let's actually now play devil's advocate like we used to always do in law school.
Yes.
Now, if you were Trump's counsel on any of these various cases, how would you advise your client?
So first of all, I just want to say I feel sorry for any of Trump's lawyers because he really demonstrated himself to be a very difficult client. I don't mean to. I don't. In some ways, that's his strength, right? His unwillingness to bend ever, and his insistence on certain things can be a strength, but it's also a weakness. And so, I don't know whether he'd be willing to take any advice, but with that caveat, I would try. Certainly I think less is more. You don't want him to go out and say all these things. There are things that he's able to use a public platform in a political way frequently to his benefit, right? He can say things and do things and go out and just speak whatever is on his mind. And that has gotten him out of a lot of political trouble. I think it really appeals to his supporters in a certain way. It conveys a kind of honesty and an unwillingness ever to give in, a sort of, a toughness that I think people like. But in the legal world, that's not helpful. So if I were his lawyers, I would try to get him to not to go off, right? Not to allow his emotional reaction to things to take over, and to answer questions fairly minimally, in a limited sort of way, such that he's not revealing any more than he has to. And I think that's a challenge. That will be a challenge for the president's lawyers.
And I think another interesting thing you tweeted about, as an attorney, also Trump's counsel has to take heed. I mean, Michael Cohen is definitely a cautionary tale, and one of the more kind of brazen lawyers that thinks that the legal license can give somebody permission to twist arms, more than what's necessary. I would say that lawyers are always going to be vigorously defending their client. But Cohen now is facing jail and has seen his client backstab him. And I think we can also look at Rudy Giuliani after he's gone around the country. And some people even argue that the lawsuits that had to do with these claims of election fraud that bore out no evidence of widespread fraud, should end in sanctions for Trump's counsel. So you tweeted out that, about the ethical obligation that an attorney might have about even kind of distorting the record if it's a defense for your client. So I was actually wondering if you can expand on that, because we're not advocating, obviously, for attorneys to go out there and lie on behalf of their client, because lawyers have a serious duty as well as officers of the court. But where does that line start to become more gray? So in the case of, Trump's impeachment counsel, for example.
Yeah. I mean, that's an excellent question. So, it's funny because people think, oh, everybody has an obligation to tell the truth, and lawyers have a special obligation to tell the truth. That's true and not true in a certain way, because, I would say lawyers, the profession as a whole, has a obligation to the truth, but we live in an adversary system, right? So, if you're representing a client, you may, in fact, especially if it's a criminal defendant, you may, in fact, be distorting the truth with the understanding that there's somebody on the other side presenting that person's case, and that the fact finder is going to then determine the truth, right? The truth, our system is dependent on the idea that, well, if there are two sides, then each side presents its facts, and that's the best way of determining the truth. So you have a situation in which lawyers do lie, actually. I mean, lie is a strong word, but
a shocker.
Yeah, exactly. So So here's where I say the line is. You don't, as a lawyer, you never lie in court, and you don't put on false testimony if you know that it's false. I think outside of court, it's much hazier. So that's why you brought up Rudy Giuliani. He's an interesting case because he was like out there and on the cable TV shows and in speeches and at rallies saying things that are just clearly not true. Some of which I think he's been sued by some of the voting companies for. But I think it's difficult to stretch to say that he should be. I mean, and there are people who disagree with me on this, but I think it's a stretch to say that he should be disciplined for those statements because those are statements on behalf of a client outside of the court. And so I think in many ways they're classic, going back to the First Amendment, those are classic political speech. And so I think lawyers have a lot of leeway when they're representing clients to kind of, engage in this sort of puffery on behalf of their clients. And, it's not that I think there's no line, but I think it's very hard to cross that line as opposed to in court. I think the court has an absolute right to control its courtroom, and regulating lawyers there is extremely important. And so I think one has to be very careful about what one says in court. And so, actually, if you looked at Rudy Giuliani, his statement, like when he was confronted in court and the judge said, are you trying to tell me that there's massive fraud? He was like, no, this isn't a fraud case. He had to say it because he wasn't going to lie to the judge. So he knew this line too. And, I do think it gives lawyers a bad name when they go out and do things like Rudy Giuliani and even the impeachment lawyers, but I just don't think discipline is the way to go. I think it's a complicated question. Just in terms of your first point, I think that's absolutely right, that Trump is not somebody who's going to accept his lawyers coming back to him and saying, look, I have an ethical obligation to do X. He's going to look at them like they're crazy, you're fired, So he's looking for kind of like bulldog lawyer like Roy Cohn was. That you got to know that that's the kind of client you're getting before you take on the representation.
And then for listeners who aren't aware, Roy Cohn was an attorney that worked extensively with, I think was it Goldwater or McCarthy, one of those, McCarthy. Yeah, and I think was, I guess, a big role model for Trump in terms of how no holds barred an attorney can be, and any person can be when it comes to, defending yourself in the claims of, just being a bad guy. And Trump looked at that and said, I want to be that guy. I want Roy Cohn. Get me Roy Cohn is a big phrase that Trump basically says. And I guess what I also wanted to follow up on, I take your point about lawyers having to obviously not lie to a judge and then being able to say something else in public. It's two different courtrooms, right, so to speak. Number one, what about the claims about a lawyer being under an ethical obligation not to file frivolous lawsuits? And B, how would any future attorney be able to reconcile those two worlds, having to basically not lie, or maybe being, maybe lie is too strong of a word, right? Because there's the intent part of it, and that's where all the lawyers are trying to answer that question. But how can any future lawyer reconcile, the duty to not speak falsities in the court in front of the judge, and then going out in public and, stretching the truth? How does a lawyer reconcile those two things?
Yeah, so the filing false, frivolous lawsuits. I mean, this is something that courts usually regulate pretty well. It's not like lawyers are getting disciplined all the time for doing that. Courts themselves, I mean, they bring, as there's Rule 11 in the federal system, and states have a similar rule that allows judges to directly sanction lawyers for doing that. And so it's interesting that the courts chose not to do it in any of these election lawsuits, but they certainly have that responsibility, that power if they want to do that. And I think part of this was a kind of understanding we're almost in an emergency situation, and that the lawsuits were actually in some ways doing more good than harm, such as it was. I mean, better if there had never been a false claim about massive election fraud, but given that there was, this was one way to fact check that this is one institution, I think, that even, as you said, your relatives who are Trump supporters and hopefully. And, the people we know and people on the left tend to still think, well, have some faith in the results. And so it was good that the courts were there to say no election fraud, no election fraud. It may not have convinced everybody. Certainly there's a corner of people, as we saw tragically on January 6th, who will not believe that. But I think a lot of people will and do. And so that's important. And, again, like what should a lawyer do under those circumstances is a very complicated question.
And have you ever had to, I don't know, I guess traverse that world of saying one thing in court and then trying to win basically in the court of public opinion? Is there anything that comes to mind, or maybe there's a memory of a colleague or adversary in your past that you'd like to share?
So, I never really had any clients because I was a prosecutor. So life's a little different when you're a prosecutor because you almost never speak to the public. And not to say you don't have a client. Your client is the public, but that's quite different. So, I certainly had experience with defense attorneys who were adversaries who really stretched that to the point where, I felt that they may have been really interfering with the proceedings by what they said in public. And, again, courts, if they feel like that's going on, they can say something while it's going on. But, defense lawyers really get a lot of leeway. And I have to say, generally, the most often defendants are not Trump or powerful people. They're really people without a lot of resources and without a lot of power. And so it's good that our system makes it hard to establish these kinds of cases, at least in the criminal context. And it can be frustrating. The mere fact that somebody is not, in jail for a crime does not mean that they didn't commit it, but that's our system and it's a good one. So it can be frustrating in an individual situation, especially such a high profile one as President Trump. But, we do have this way of, making sure that, innocent people don't go to jail. And that requires us to sometimes let guilty people go free. And so, I'm not saying I don't know that Trump committed any of these crimes, but, even if he did, we're not necessarily going to see him in jail. And that's a frustration, but it's a frustration that we have to live with for our democracy, which, I believe works extremely well. And I wish a greater portion of our public really understood and respected, because if they did, I think they, would be more likely to be backing away from President Trump at the moment rather than staying in his camp.
Right. And I think that anybody that is unhappy with maybe a result in the criminal system, they should know that there's always recourse for relief in the civil system. And you've pointed out many times in our conversation that, if Trump doesn't even end up going to jail or anything, and who knows, he might get probation or something, but that doesn't mean that the same claims can't be pursued in a civil court with monetary damages. I'm sure that there's some sort of contract claims out there that don't just involve Mary Trump, but also involve the former workers at one of Trump's resorts. So there's a myriad of different avenues for people to pursue their claims. For our listeners who have already given up hope, there's many things that Trump has to worry about. And for, I guess the listeners who are also cutting Trump more slack, I mean, there is something to say about the myriad also of different ways the justice system protects people from being innocently thrown in jail. And I think that says something about the way our founding fathers have crafted our constitutional republic. So we are just about done with our time with you, Professor. And I think that my last question to you is, what is something that you are keeping an eye on that you think, the media hasn't been, that you think that the public should be? Is there anything that has been on your watch list that you think people should be aware of?
I think that the, media is very vigilant in terms of Trump and, how Trump might be held responsible and what might happen to Trump. I think, it's in many ways the moral of this story And sorry if this really sounds cliched, but, it's a democracy if we can keep it. And, one of the challenges of keeping it is to be vigilant, not only of the other side. When you disagree with somebody's politics, it's easy to cast stones and say that person is damaging our democracy. I think it's really important to look at one's own political team and, see where, now that we know that democracy is a little bit more fragile than we thought it was, I think we should be very careful about everybody and not only focus on people whose ideology we disagree with, but also on those whom we agree with, because that's when we've seen it, right? That's when you turn a blind eye. That's when I think, a lot of the Republicans, were unwilling to see what a lot of the Democrats saw. And, if the tables are turned, then Democrats should not behave in the same way, right? This disease can happen on either side of the aisle. And so, I think it's important that we reestablish values that both sides, and I know this is like, Biden tries to say this over and over again, and sometimes it sounds kind of sappy, but like, what is it that is American, and what is it that we can all get behind? And if it isn't the Constitution and democracy and the institutions that have developed over the course of, these 200 years, then I don't know what it is. I mean, it's those values that are embodied in them, but it's also our system. And so I have my eye on ways in which they're those are being eroded and attacked, not only by Trump and his followers, by others as well. And I think it's really important to do that, especially because, the allegations of fake news are frustrating and false. But I think news increasingly, and I think you mentioned this earlier, news increasingly, we're in our bubbles, and news does have, frequently a bias. And so we listen to particular things and we view things a particular way, and we tend to have our views confirmed. And so I just am vigilant and making sure that we don't grow complacent.
Professor, that's all the time we have with you today. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending a little bit of time on a Thursday, at the time that we're recording this, to come on and educate our listeners about what Trump might have to face in the future. So thank you so much for your insight and for your really just admirable work on these issues. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and it's a particular pleasure to speak with such a well-informed former student. You asked me extremely hard, difficult, and important questions. And
stop it. That's it for this episode of the 25th Hour, helping you beat the 24/7 news cycle every Sunday afternoon. I ask that you please rate, subscribe, and share this podcast to your friends, and don't forget to become a Patreon today at patreon.com/the25thhournews. As always, you can email your tips and suggestions at the25thhournews@gmail.com. Follow us on most of your social media platforms and spread New York City's soon-to-be top-rated political podcast.